This play is a classic because everyone in America should see it.
This play is a classic because Lorraine Hansberry is a craftswoman, an artist, an activist, and just a creative, heartfelt tour de force all in one.
This is our history. This is our legacy.
Hello, and welcome to This is a Classic, the Expand the Canon Theater podcast. We're your hosts,
Emily Lyon, curator of Expand the Canon and artistic director of Hedgepig Ensemble.
and me, Skye Pagon, curator for Expand the Canon and member of the Hedgepig Ensemble. And we're here to introduce you to some plays by women that are classics.
Classics! Expand the Canon is a program of Hedgepig Ensemble, a Brooklyn-based company that reimagines the classics, creating a legacy of storytelling with gender equity at its core.
This literally is one of my favorite plays of all time. I will say it.
Yes.
It's oh my god.
It is so good. Well, this was the first play that was on the list.
Oh yeah.
We read this play and we were like,
Done,
this goes on
done,
the list.
done.
Done. I remember when we were having a meeting, I had read this play and another Lorraine Hansberry play, and I almost couldn't talk about it at first. I was like,
Yeah.
we have to come back to me. Hold on. I can't. I just have so many thoughts and feelings, and I'm like, I felt full, emotionally,
Yes.
intellectually
Yes.
full.
So Emily, what play are we here to talk about today?
We are thrilled beyond thrilled to talk to you today about Les Blancs by Lorraine Hansberry. So, if you're looking to tackle race, imperialism, and the prejudice of the Western world towards African countries, consider this mesmerizing masterpiece. Set in a rural Christian mission in an unnamed African country, this play explores the complexities of navigating personal relationships across racial divides when every decision you make is inherently political. Intricate, atmospheric, and shimmering with emotional truth, this play is as relevant to our modern world now as it was 50 years ago.
Lorraine Hansberry is the GOAT!
Yes. And I feel like while I like that pitch, there's so much more to say about this play. I can't believe we even ended up writing a short paragraph about it because I want to write books.
I cannot believe how much she manages to pack in without it being either confusing, overwritten, or having anything become sort of shallow. It's complex and deep, but everything is woven together so well that there's nothing that is wasted in this play.
I think the word you keep using, woven, is really right on. It is a layered piece, and what I think is incredible about her as a writer and about this as a play is that each scene you see a new layer, you see a new element, and it becomes a richer and deeper conversation about the personal ramifications of these both huge political, racial, divisive topics, and yet they remain in every scene and every moment deeply personal and intimate and clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think her ability to layer that and be doing both simultaneously, and she just navigates that and threads that needle through every moment of this play, and it is one of the many reasons I am obsessed.
It's also manages to be, which you were sort of touching on, is it manages to deal with these really big political issues, these social issues, in a way that is so personal and real. It's there's a lot of really explicit conversations in this play about imperialism, about race, about the attitudes of the Western world towards African countries, as we say in our pitch. But it's through these really grounded characters that feel very human, that feel very emotional, and so they make these very weighty ideas very grounded and real.
Yeah, I want everyone in America to read this play or see this play or engage with this play. I think we've been in conversation about what is it to unpack both the Black experience in America, but also like unpack what it is, what exactly white supremacy looks like, and how it shows up, and it's many ways that it, I don't know, mutates our relationships and colors our expectations and is just ever present in so many of our interactions. And I think that LeBlanc really shows doesn't tell what many of those like little insidious expectations and assumptions and problems look like, and how there's always, there's something rotten at the core of the society, of white supremacy, of many of our interactions through history. And I think she unravels that truth, beauty, and artistry such as I haven't seen in maybe anything else.
Yeah. It's also, I think, and we'll get to this also in sort of talking about Lorraine Hansberry herself, is like, she is somebody who really understood the global interconnectedness of all these things, of how racism in America, the Black experience in America, is tied to imperialism in Africa by Western countries and by British countries. All these things are interconnected. And in order to uproot white supremacy, in order to uproot colonialism, you can't sort of be surgical about it. It has to be happening on a global scale. And if you don't understand the sort of macrocosm of how these things play into each other, you're always going to end up losing. You can't reform something just a little bit. You kind of have to uproot the problem everywhere it exists, because otherwise it's just going to keep coming back. And that's the thing that this play does so well, is it's like, this is a play that it is on its face about colonialism in Africa. But if you were to say that to a lot of audience members in America, people would be like, oh, but like, that's thousands and thousands of miles away.
Right, that's separate.
Exactly, and it's not. It's like absolutely not at all.
But I think that that's brilliant, because it also maybe means that more Americans could like listen to it, because it's not necessarily as clearly on its face pointed at the U.S., but of course it absolutely is. So deeply is, yeah.
She pulls no punches in this play.
Oh,
it
no.
is like searing indictment of colonialism and capitalism in a lot of ways, and white supremacy and the American role in colonial Africa, like all these things. And it's like,
but it's a slow burn. It's searing, but it doesn't jump. It never really points fingers in an incredible way. It doesn't just like go there, but it goes there. Like, I don't know how to explain that other than like, it is a slow sear, but absolutely. And I think it's so interesting watching all of the do-gooder white folks who are trying to just put a Band-Aid on something that they don't even understand.
Yes. And I think also that's the thing that I think is really important about this play, is it's not the sort of what I think is palatable to white audiences plays about racism, where it's like, here's that one sort of southern sounding racist guy who uses slurs that we can blame racism on. And it's like, no, it's also like, if we're saying white supremacy, that means all white people are inherently a part of this by buying into it, by, their actions, whether they intend to or not. And so this play is about how even the people who like theoretically have good intention. There's a great line. I'm going to misquote it slightly, but it's something along the lines of well-intentioned imperialism is still imperialism.
And as we like shift into talking about the summary of this play, I think that will be so clear as to like the many different ways that there are well-intentioned white people, and why we should just generally stop those narratives.
Yeah. I also want to say just one more thing I love about this play is it's like really theatrical, because sometimes you see a play and you're like, that could have been an essay. Like, she is a writer who is taking advantage of her medium. The
one thing I think was interesting that we didn't bring up is that like the inspiration for this play was a response to Jean Genet's The Blacks, which I love. I mean, I love a feminist clapback, but I just think it's so badass that she not only was like, this is in response to the thing that you said, where you're romanticizing this relationship. Let me not just respond, but let me drop like truth bomb after truth bomb and be so authentic and honest as I do it.
Yeah.
I'm so glad she saw that play. I'm so glad she saw that play and got mad and wrote this instead.
Legacy.
Okay, so this is a very complicated play, as we've seen. As we said, there's a lot of different characters. So bear with me. I promise it's all important. So at the start of this play, we meet Charlie Morris, who is an American journalist, and he has just arrived at this Christian mission compound in an unnamed African country to write a piece about the mission there, specifically the Reverend Nielsen, who started the place and runs it with his wife, Madame Nielsen. And so he arrives to find the Reverend Nielsen is actually absent. And so he's greeted at the compound by the two doctors there, Dr. Marta Gotterling and Dr. Ville de Koven. This is like a Doctors Without Borders situation. They're like, they've started their own sort of clinic there. And they begin to get Charlie settled in. And they have like this conversation about how he needs to sort of disabuse himself of his expectations. He's remarking a lot on the clinic they've set up there is very crude. It's lacking sort of modern Western traditional medical facilities, and the doctors are saying like, we make do with what we can, we don't have access to those things, but like we're doing our best, and what you read about in the American papers isn't necessarily what the experience of being in this country is like.
And we see that. We see them treating some patients, and it's not just that the setup is crude, but they can be fairly glib at times too with the people they're treating. Yeah.
So throughout this whole conversation, they are seeing various patients, and people come from all over to get treated at this clinic. And throughout this scene, as they're having this conversation and as Charlie's getting settled in and they're treating these patients, periodically there's like drum sounds heard, and the doctors are like kind of vague about what they mean. They don't seem to know specifically what they are. But eventually there are gunshots heard, and Charlie's kind of alarmed by this. It's like, oh, gunshots, that's kind of scary. And the doctors are like, oh, but we're living in a war zone. That's kind of normal. And there's sort of like this clear sense of the news that has been reported about what is going on in this country in Africa is like not actually maybe what's actually going on. So Charlie comes in expecting one thing, and then there's some gunshots, and the mission isn't that well set up, and like the vibes are weird. And then right after these gunshots come in, there's this guy, a military man named Major Rice. He enters, joins them, and he's clearly kind of hostile towards Charlie as a journalist, and clearly very hostile to the various African villagers around them. He refers to them as terrorists and lots of other sort of loaded racialized language. And he asks Charlie if he can read Charlie's letters before Charlie sends them out, sort of continuing to imply that they don't want the realities of the violence of this area to get out. So Charlie refuses this and remarks that he is surprised that things are so contentious. And he's particularly surprised that things are so contentious because he was referencing there's a local politician from the area, a man named Amos Khumalo, who's currently in Europe, lobbying on behalf of the native African population against the sort of settler colonial forces and trying to find some sort of political power for the native people, because, this is a country that has been living under colonial rule. So there's this occupying settler population that has representation in the government, and meanwhile the native population does not. So this man, Khumalo, is sort of like the voice of this country and is trying to work to get them more political power. And Charlie is remarking that oh, this is a great thing. This is a great time. Shouldn't we be excited for this and what it might mean for the country? But the doctors are kind of dismissive of this idea. And Rice is kind of dismissive of this idea, and they're sort of making the argument that nothing is going to happen because the white colonial settlers are angry that Europe is negotiating at all with this guy, and the local African population is angry because they're still sort of taking this sort of diplomatic talk angle as opposed to anything practical actually happening. And that theme of, talking and using the sort of traditional diplomatic route versus more what we would call direct action is going to be a pervasive theme going forward.
Right.
So anyway, so all this happens. Rice then sort of goes off to deal with quote-unquote supposed terrorist that he caught in the bush. And then Reverend Nielsen's wife, Madame Nielsen, comes in. She's this elderly old woman. She's got very sort of like nice old grandma vibes. And she joins Charlie and she sort of laments the change. She says that like when they founded the mission, they had this really great relationship with the local villagers. They were really close to them. They were friends. And then something shifted very suddenly and now nobody will speak to them. And she specifically blames this shift on an older man who lives in the nearby mission named Matosa, saying that the antipathy kind of started with him. And so throughout this conversation where she's telling Charlie all this young guy, lighter-skinned African man named Eric comes in to sort of sneak some liquor, and Madame Nielsen remarks specifically on him and the fact that he has light skin and an English-sounding name, and she says, like, Dr. de Koven sometimes leaves out some liquor for him, and she sort of makes some veiled comments about the fact that his light skin and his English-sounding name are not coincidental. So clearly something strange is happening with this young guy who's like a teenager.
Yeah, and it's also sort of seen as like rowdy and other, both like other
Yes.
from the white mission, but also other from the Black community, the African
Yes.
community.
So meanwhile, while Charlie's getting settled in, we meet a young man named Chembe who has just returned to the village dressed in European clothes, and he comes to the house where his brother, the very same Eric, lives. So he's Eric's older brother, and he's been away for a very long time, living and working in Europe. Comes out that he's actually even recently been married to a European woman. He had a kid with her, but he has returned home because his father, the old Matosa, who Madame Nielsen was talking about as like potentially the source of some of the antipathy towards the mission, old Matosa has been in ill health, and so Eric had sent for Chembe to come home see his father before he dies. Unfortunately for Chembe, it is revealed when he arrives that his father, old Matosa, had actually died only the night before, waiting for Chembe to come home. So Chembe is, clearly devastated about this. He's really upset. But he's happy to see Eric. It's been a really long time since he's been home, so they have this really sweet scene where they're catching up, and the conversation sort of turns lightly to politics. They talk a little bit about Kumalo, the local politician. And it's clear from the way Chembe is talking that at least at some point in his life, he was fairly aligned with the sort of revolutionary cause against the white settlers. He seems more sort of like the retired revolutionary now. He seems like he's kind of distanced himself from it.
And it's also just important to note, like, even though Eric is clearly light-skinned, Chembe is not.
Yes. So they start talking about their other brother, Abiosa, and wishing he was there. He hasn't been home in a while. And as they're talking about here, oh my God, Abiosa appears. Amazing. Abiosa is the oldest brother. They don't see him much. They're thrilled to see him. But then it comes out, and in that conversation, that Abiosa is actually about to be ordained as a priest.
Yeah.
And Chembe does not like that at all. So they have sort of a very tense conversation about it. And it's like this very complicated situation where like they're sort of arguing who gets to align themselves more as African versus who's more European. Like, is Chembe more European because he lives in Europe and has a European wife? Is Abiosa more European because he's aligned himself with this European religion?
And here spreading it, yeah.
Yeah, and that's very complicated. They're just arguing about this, and eventually Chembe sort of storms off to take part in his father's burial, which will be this big traditional ceremony, and he storms off to do that. So, trouble at home. So back at the mission, meanwhile, Major Rice comes in to interrupt the daily business with the doctors and Charlie to say that there have been some attacks on settler families and the white colonial settler families, and a number of them have been killed. And, these are attacks that are by local sort of revolutionary forces against the colonial families. And
they also were killing, like, the children in those families as well.
Yeah.
Which is something that is, like, really upsets him.
Yes. Everybody's really upset about that, and they're sort of processing what this means and what it might mean for them within this community when Chembe comes in to visit Madame Nielsen. And it's very clear they've had a historically warm relationship, and he's just about to leave after chatting with her and catching up when Major Rice stops him and asks him why he doesn't have his papers with him. And this becomes very tense because everyone is like, this is Chembe, you know him, you clearly know him, you addressed him by his name, why are you asking for his papers? And Major Rice is doing the like, well, I'm doing my job, he has to follow the rules kind of thing. And Charlie kind of tries to diffuse the situation, doesn't work, and Rice goes off on this like very racist, very pro-imperialist diatribe about how he, Major Rice, grew up in this country and has therefore as much a right to be there and defend himself as anyone else, and how they won't suffer for this violence, and how Chembe should go tell his fellow countrymen that, or they'll be sorry.
Cool.
Not great. Nobody really says anything. Everybody else leaves. Chembe is left alone with Charlie. And Charlie, the journalist, is like, I'm gonna chat up this guy. Let's have a chat. I want to drink, like, hang out with me. And Chembe is initially like,
It's been a big day.
Yeah.
For Charlie.
Yeah. But Chembe is like very much like initially, I do not want to chat with this random dude.
Because there's also like a curfew too. Like I can't get stuck here with you with this curfew going on.
Yes. So he's initially very reticent, but like Charlie convinces him. He like makes some jokes about well-intentioned white folks and like promises not to talk about race or colonialism. So Chembe relents, and then Charlie proceeds to do exactly what he said he wasn't going to do and talk about race and colonialism.
Cool, bro.
So he So he reveals he's gone rogue from his newspaper, actually, to come do this story. He was supposed to be doing something else, and he just like got on a different airplane because he says he was so moved and impressed by the work that the Reverend and his wife are doing here, that this mission is doing in the country. And Chembe is kind of like, whoa, dude. And this is where that great line came in of like, well-intentioned imperialism is still imperialism. Like, you know, they might be coming in here with some good thoughts, but like, let's not pretend that like they are solving the problem.
Just because they have good press doesn't mean it's actually good stuff.
Yes. And then they proceed to have this like incredible scene about, and this is where that sort of skill of Hansberry's of like talking about these very heady ideas from like a place of emotional truth really comes through. So like they cover colonial politics and Western attitudes towards Africa and American treatment of Black people. And it's like Charlie's very much trying to make the point of like, we're on the same side. Like we're all just trying to help you. And Chembe is like, why do you think I need your help? Who are you to tell me what help I need from you? And it's very complicated, and all this is just suddenly, they're like getting pretty heated, and then this is brought to a sudden halt because Chembe has this vision of this woman who's clearly the embodiment of like this traditional female warrior figure, clearly someone he sort of recognizes, and he tries to ward her off, saying that he's left all this, he's left this fight, it's not his fight anymore, he's married, he's in Europe, he has a wife, he has a kid, but she won't listen, and she continues to press him, and there's this great moment she like tries to hand him a spear, and he's like, I'm done with spears. End of the act.
That's definitely one of the scenes that I just can't get out of my mind. That scene.
I know, it's an unbelievable scene. So, time passes. Dr. Marta and Charlie have been getting a little flirty until he starts questioning her about the Reverend Nielsen and the mission's role here and who Eric's father might be, and she gets very defensive and leaves. Charlie visits Chembe to try and convince him to use Chembe's position of authority and sort of his ability to align himself with the Europeans and then align himself with the native African population to talk to his fellow villagers to try and cease the violence. And they argue again. Chembe's trying to make Charlie understand that the native population has tried nonviolence for decades and nobody cared. And that in fact, violence was used against them for even longer and nobody cared. And Charlie is like not getting it and eventually leaves. Another great scene. And then these two other villagers come to visit Chembe. And I wish I had time to like talk more about who all these people are, because like even the sort of quote unquote bit characters in this play are not bit characters. One of them is a servant, a guy who has been sort of working as a servant for Major Rice, who, surprise, surprise, is a double agent. And
thankfully
has come to convince Chembe to join the Revolutionary Council. And they tell him that actually Chembe's father, Old Matosa, who Madame Nielsen had been talking about at the top of the play as like a potential ringleader in this revolution, had in fact been that ringleader, and they try and convince Chembe that he should take up his father's mantle essentially and lead the revolution. And Chembe refuses, saying he doesn't want to be any part of the violence. So they leave. They're not happy. And then things start really disintegrating. So Major Rice comes back in and assumes military command of the mission. None of the doctors or Madame Nielsen will really stand up to him despite Charlie's pleas. There's this great scene between Dr. DeKoven and Charlie where Dr. DeKoven is like, yeah, I've realized that we're imperialists here and it's bad. And Charlie is like, how can you say that? And DeKoven is like, how can you be in this world and have your eyes open and not see that? It's really fascinating. So nobody will stand up to Rice. And then worse, Rice tells them that that local politician, Amos Khumalo, who had been the hope of the revolution, was arrested for, quote, inciting violence. Obviously trumped up charges. The warrior woman, the mystical warrior woman, returns again for Chembe, and this time he accepts her invitation. So, rolling back slightly, Abiosa, Chembe's older brother, who was trying to be a priest, had just found out accidentally from young Eric who the central figures of this revolutionary plot are. Namely, that it was that sort of double agent figure who'd been working with Rice. And he goes and he tells Major Rice this. And Rice returns to the compound with this servant character who goes by Peter but is actually named Nagalo, and says he's going to make an example of him, and he shoots him in front of everybody. And Rice also reveals that there's been another attack on a nearby settlement and that Reverend Nielsen himself was killed. Woof. So a lot of death. There's very much a sense of impending doom, and Madame Nielsen confesses to Charlie that, like, the Reverend was kind of anti-Black all along. She reveals that Major Rice was actually Eric's biological father, and that Eric's mother had died in childbirth because the Reverend wouldn't intercede to help her because he was so anti-interracial marriages / children that he would prefer to have a woman die and the child die than intervene. So Madame Nielsen herself had delivered the child.
Which is so heartbreaking for so many reasons, because Madame Nielsen was so close to her, but also, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we say that Major Rice was the father of Eric, I mean, yeah, he's the father, but it's not like they were having a productive relationship that was super loving. Is not what I got from that.
It's never explicitly said what the nature of that relationship is. I think it is very easy to assume that it was not consensual based on the way Major Rice acts and the way everybody is about it. So, like, clearly, like, terrible, terrible situation, and, like, poor Eric has been left to suffer for it. And so Madame Nielsen and Dr. DeKoven, who's the doctor who's always drunk, who had given liquor to Eric, are kind of the only people who, like, ever looked out for him in their own way.
And that, too, like, when his mother died it seems like when the mission went bad. Like, even though there were anti-Black sentiments from the Reverend before, it's like that's when the waters really got poisoned.
Well, it was that, and it was also old Matosa Chembe's father had been doing this, and him and his revolutionary council and some of the other local leaders had been doing this thing where they would like sort of draw up essentially like potential laws or petitions or things like that, and they would show that they were going to bring to the local settler government to lobby them for like more land restrictions, voice on the council, things like that. And they would show them to the Reverend for advice, and he would sort of give them notes. And then one time they had come to him with a petition to ask for a voice in the government, and he dismissed them and was like, I won't help you with this. So that was the beginning of the end, really. Like, you wanted us to get along as long as I didn't ask for a seat at the table. Yep. So bad. So all this is happening, and everybody knows, based on everything that's happened to this point, Rice killing this character in Gallo and the Reverend dying, that the mission is about to become a target. So Charlie and the doctors are evacuated. Charlie and Chembe have this moment where before Charlie leaves where they shake hands. Charlie is like, I swear I heard what you were trying to tell me. Like, I've been listening. And Chembe is like very clearly unconvinced by that, but they do shake hands. Madame Nielsen remains behind. She's like, this is my home. I'm not leaving. The revolutionaries enter with Abiosa, Chembe's brother, who had betrayed their cause to Major Rice, and Chembe himself shoots him. And then the soldiers, Major Rice's military forces, storm the compound. They fight the revolutionaries. Madame Nielsen is killed in the crossfire, and the mission is burned to the ground. Everybody leaves, and Chembe is left alone with the wreckage of his former home and the bodies of Madame Nielsen and Abiosa. And that's the end of the play.
I mean, this is what you were saying too. Like, Lorraine Hansberry is so good at using her medium. It's a deeply theatrical play, and that's why we can tell you all about it, and it will still never convey the beauty of Leblanc, of this play, of her brilliance.
History.
So, who is Lorraine Hansberry? Lorraine Vivian Hansberry was born on May 19th in 1930 in Chicago, Illinois. She was the youngest of 4 kids. Her father was a real estate broker, and her mother taught at a driving school and served as a local ward committee woman. Sort of early formative experiences. In 1938, her family bought a house in the predominantly white area of the south side of Chicago called the Washington Park subdivision. And this very much annoyed their new white neighbors, who didn't want a black family living next door, and they decided to fight the Hansberrys through the legal system. So, this is in the post-restoration era of a lot of redlining, a lot of housing disparities. Chicago had a lot of issues with that. And the Hansberrys, though, are fighting back. And so the case, Hansberry versus Lee, eventually escalated to the Supreme Court of the United States.
I didn't know that, actually.
Oh my god, yes. So it's kind of complicated. The court basically ruled that the white neighbors of Hansberry's were using the zoning laws improperly to oust them, so they couldn't oust them. So there's a later court case. This is a whole rabbit hole you can go into, and it's really interesting. I highly recommend it.
I wonder if this, inspired a play or anything.
More on that later. But the case, it didn't outlaw the actual legalese, basically, that the white neighbors were using. It just said that they were using it improperly in this case. There was a later case in a few years after that outlawed this sort of zoning entirely. Super interesting rabbit hole. Anyway, as Emily alluded to, this experience with housing discrimination might go on to influence the young Lorraine Hansberry in a number of plays, perhaps one day leading her to some Tony nominations. More on that later. So, as you may have gathered, the Hansberrys were very active in the Chicago NAACP and in local politics, and their home was this frequent hub for a lot of black activists and celebrities in the civil rights movement, people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington and Jesse Owens. So Lorraine Hansberry is growing up, getting access and to these voices in the civil rights movement, and it's going to go on to be a huge influence on her life.
It's so cool that she saw her mother being a big part of that too. Right, it wasn't just
mother's a local politician. Yeah.
Not just these amazing men.
The whole family. And if you look, her siblings go on to do stuff too. It's real. They're a cool family. So this, as we said, runs in the family. Lorraine Hansberry herself went on to attend the University of Wisconsin at Madison.
She was a badger.
Where I don't know what that means. For sure.
I think that's their mascot.
Your Midwest is showing.
Sorry, excuse me. Pardon.
So she went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she promptly became very active in the local Communist Party and led the fight to integrate a campus dormitory. She's baller. After graduating, she briefly went on to work in electoral politics. She worked on Henry A. Wallace's 1948 presidential campaign. I didn't know who he was either. He lost, but he was a progressive candidate.
He definitely lost.
Yeah. So she also spent a summer studying painting in Mexico, because why not? So just a very intellectually curious, creative, driven woman. So after these experiences, she moved to New York in 1950 to pursue a career in writing. And in 1951, she joined the staff of the black newspaper in Harlem titled Freedom, which ran for about 5 years. And she moved up to Harlem. And her writing and her editorial work there was notably political, and as we sort of alluded to in some of our earlier conversations, she very much had this understanding, vocal outspokenness for the sort of interconnectedness of a lot of these isms. So she's drawing connections between class politics and the communist agenda and the fight against white supremacy and colonialism and all these things and how they are interconnected. And she was very vocal on the fight for racial and gender equality on a global scale in addition to a domestic one. She, was writing about politics in Africa as much as she was writing about, voting rights in the South. And she was very staunchly anti-imperialist and colonialist, as we see in works like Les
And,
Blancs.
that was before intersectional was a term, but I think
Yes.
that's so many of her views is just like how intersectional everything, all of these dimensions are.
And it's a thing that like we often are like skirting around in our education system in conversations about the early civil rights movement, is a lot of it was connected to communism. The Black Panther Party had communist ties, and like these things, this sort of class solidarity with race solidarity with gender equity was like very interconnected in a lot of ways. And we like to gloss over that because racist capitalist reasons.
Yeah, because if it's in a silo, we can just put a Band-Aid on that specific thing.
Yes. So during her time at Freedom Magazine, she began to write some scripts for some of the they had these like newspaper pageants and celebrations, and she would just write these little scripts for them, and thus began her foray into theater. So she married a man named Robert Nemiroff in 1953. He was a songwriter and a political activist, and this allowed Hansberry to transition to writing full-time. They did separate pretty quickly. They separated in 1957 and they divorced a few years later, although they retained a professional relationship until Hansberry's death. Oh. So in 1957, that same year they separated, Hansberry wrote what would go on to be her history-making play, A Raisin in the Sun, drawing from a lot on those experiences with housing discrimination back in Chicago. I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast, you are at least familiar with it. If you haven't read it, please God, read it. It's brilliant. This opened on Broadway in 1959. It was nominated for 4 Tonys, including Best Play. This was the first time a Black woman playwright had a play on Broadway. She was 29 years old. And this led to like this meteoric rise to fame. Overnight, she's, well known. The play's translated in 35 languages. She's commissioned by a number of film studios to write several more projects, including a film of Raisin and then a television show about slavery called The Drinking Gourd, both of which were at the last second rejected by the networks for being, quote, too controversial.
Ugh.
The Drinking Gourd you can still find scripts of. I think in one of the anthologies that has Les Blancs, you can read at least parts of that. So following this rise to fame and her divorce, Hansberry, who had long been a closeted lesbian, felt...
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So she was under a lot of pressure to hide her feelings from the public eye. She didn't feel comfortable. This is the 1950s. She like, it's very much not cool to be out. I'm sure it's extremely not cool to be out as a woman of color, as a Black woman.
And when you're like trailblazing and feel like you have to represent everyone that looks like you.
Yeah, exactly. So she's like really stressed about this. She did contribute some letters to a few queer rights organizations and magazines. She never published under her full name. It was always under her initials. And she never like openly aligned herself with the gay liberation movement. However, later in her life, after her divorce, and a little further on into success, she did seem to be getting more comfortable openly sort of navigating her sexuality. She developed this network of queer friends. She started having a few relationships with other women, and she began vacationing in Provincetown.
Get it?
Yep. However, all of this is tragically cut so short. She developed pancreatic cancer at the age of 34 and died within a year. So unbelievably young. And she's like on this just upward trajectory. She had her performance of Raisin just 5 years before, and 5 years later she's dead. It's unbelievably tragic. Her funeral was attended by the likes of activists like Paul Robeson and James Foreman, and there were messages read aloud from both James Baldwin and Martin Luther King at her funeral, sort of acknowledging her unique voice and the genius that she had, and what a loss it was to both like the Black community, but also just like culture as a whole, because she was an artistic voice that comes once in a generation, and she died so young. So although she had only lived to see 2 of her plays performed, one was Raisin, one was The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, which we recommend, great play. She had lived to see many of her other writings published, a lot of essays and articles, and a lot of her work was published posthumously at the behest of her ex-husband, including Les Blancs. So she remains, to this day, one of the most influential writers, activists, thinkers of the 20th century. The loss of her genius truly is incalculable, but the works that she did manage to put out there in such a short life are just a gift, and how lucky we are that she like got to share what she did with us. So yeah, that's Lorraine Hansberry.
I will never have enough Lorraine Hansberry in my life.
Yeah.
None of us will.
Dum, dum.
Thank you for joining us for our Le Blanc edition of This is a Classic, the Expand the Canon podcast. Find where to get this script and learn more at expandthecanon.com.
If you believe in the importance of expanding the canon, please give us a 5-star review and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Then hit the share button and forward it along to a friend, a colleague, or a professor. Forward the script to a friend. I did that the other day. Let's make it go everywhere. Everyone should read this play. If you haven't heard us say that enough.
For info on what's up next, you can follow us on Instagram
At Hedgepig Ensemble Theater
or Facebook,
/ Hedgepig Ensemble Theater.
or you can join our mailing list at hedgepigensemble.org. You can also, I've just remembered, we have a TikTok now, so find us on TikTok. Hey!
Hey! You can also support this effort by donating at the link in the comments below.
Once again, I'm Skye Pagon.
And I'm Emily Lyon.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Read this play.